So the first thing you're probably wondering is why Churchill's essay is titled "If Lee Had Not Won the Battle of Gettysburg." After all, in our own history, General Robert E. Lee did not win the Battle of Gettysburg. It was a Union victory that nearly ended the war in the Union's favor. And that's because Winston's essay is a sort of alternate history within an alternate history. It's a work whose narrator, which Churchill is sort of writing as, has taken on the role of a historian from the alternate universe where the Confederates won, and is discussing the history in his universe of how the Confederates won and what that caused, and is also discussing our own history in the real world as if it itself is a hypothetical. And I think Churchill wrote it this way specifically to confuse me while I was writing this script. Anyway, Churchill, or the narrator that he's writing as, begins the essay by talking about how easily history can be changed, noting that his universe's General Lee's victory hinged on minor details, such as the timely arrival of Jeb Stuart's cavalry behind Union lines. The narrator argues that had General Meade fortified his communications, scouted his flanks, or intercepted a key letter from Jefferson Davis, Pickett's charge might have failed, leading to a Union victory and the Confederacy's eventual collapse. All of which are things that happened in our own real history, except for the interception of a letter from Davis. Instead, however, in this universe, Lee's triumph at Gettysburg, followed by the fall of Vicksburg 2 days later, allows General Robert E. Lee to establish a headquarters in Washington, D.C. The rapid collapse of the Union Army causes a flight of Northern politicians up to New York, presumably showing us the sheer scale of the Union defeat, though the narrator also praises President Lincoln's dignity during this situation. The narrator then argues that Lee's military success alone would not have altered world history without his political skills. And you might want to sit down for this one. The narrator then explains that General Lee took power from Jefferson Davis in this alternate world, issuing, for some reason, a declaration abolishing slavery, while maintaining Confederate independence. Right. So this decision aligns the Confederacy with Western moral standards, causing a British-Confederate alliance to be formalized within a month, using Britain's naval power to break the Union blockade, restore Southern finances, and secure Confederate control over the Mississippi River. Lincoln, who is now deprived of the moral cause of abolition, because again, Lee has abolished slavery in the South, cannot justify a war solely for Union sovereignty, supposedly, again according to the narrator, and so he gives a speech in Madison Square Garden recognizing the South's independence and committing to end slavery on the continent, leading to the Treaty of Harper's Ferry, which formalizes Southern independence and emancipation in both the United States and Confederate States of America. The Confederate victory also, for some reason, reshapes British politics in this alternate history. William Gladstone, who was initially pro-Confederate, resigns from Lord Palmerston's cabinet, but joins a Tory-led coalition with Lord Robert Cecil, becoming a champion of the British Empire and Anglo-Confederate unity. This realignment transforms Gladstone into a Tory stalwart who now leverages his statecraft to ensure a lasting British-Confederate alliance. Conversely, Benjamin Disraeli, who is historically conservative, now aligns with the so-called radical masses who supported the Union, and the narrator attributes these shifts to the moral and political ripple effects of Lee's victory. The effects of a victory in the American Civil War before America was a superpower affecting British politics. It's playful, very, very odd, but certainly interesting. So the Treaty of Harper's Ferry creates, of course, two Americas: the Confederate States, who are now aligned with Britain, and the truncated United States, who are now slowly becoming revanchist, like post-Franco-Prussian War France. The Confederacy expands south by conquering Mexico in 1884, not like just northern Mexico, but all of Mexico, building a massive army from the Mexican population of 700,000 men, who just, for whatever reason, are now perfectly fine with being Confederate citizens. And both nations, the North and the South, would adopt compulsory military service, supposedly sort of because there are these tensions building up. By 1905, both American countries are in a very tense state of affairs, and there's this, as the narrator puts it, global war fever from the Russo-Japanese War, exacerbated by what the Russians fear to be potential British involvement due to the sort of alliance and treaty obligations between Britain and Japan, who were allies around this time. Any such global crisis, however, and you might want to sit down again, is averted by the Covenant of the English-Speaking Association, signed on Christmas Day 1905 by Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States, Arthur Balfour, and Confederate President Woodrow Wilson. This is my favorite thing ever written, in case you can't tell. All of the tension that the narrator is building up is just averted by this incredible alliance that literally establishes a common citizenship among the British Empire, the United States, and the Confederacy, preserving these nations like national autonomy, while literally it's essentially like this European Union style confederation of the English-speaking world. So the ESA, which is the acronym for it, prevents conflict by insisting on mutual disarmament in the Americas, which is just great. They just get rid of all the Americans' arms. That's certainly going to go over well. And then economic cooperation between the three, which does make sense, transforming the English-speaking world into this unified bloc. So basically, the Confederate victory produces the Anglosphere, guys, and world peace. Oh yeah, not to mention, in 1914, the English-speaking association's influence, by the way, with the Americas still disarmed, averts World War I, because of course it does. During the July crisis, with Germany, Austria, and Russia on the verge of war, the ESA's Disarmament Conference issues a declaration demanding a 10-mile buffer zone along all borders in Europe, threatening a united war effort from the British, the Americans, and the Confederates, again with the Americans and the Confederates having been disarmed, against any violator of these buffer zones. So basically it's saying we'll go to war with anyone who actually, sparks war from the July crisis. All the great powers magically comply, averting the Great War altogether, and the narrator then speculates that a European war would have led to millions of deaths, trench warfare, and economic devastation, with Britain afterward likely facing high taxes and unemployment. I wonder where you could have gotten that from. I think this might be my favorite. No, my second favorite part of the essay. The ESA's success inspires the European Union to form, with Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was himself described as having let out a yelp of joy when the ESA saved him from war, leading a pan-European conference in 1932. And that's where the story ends. So it's a very entertaining essay, and it is well written, like in terms of the writing style, but there are leaps. Huge leaps that are more reminiscent of like a fan fiction than a counterfactual. I mean, the Confederate victory at Gettysburg creates a world where Anglo-American unity prevents war and promotes global diplomatic progress that we wouldn't see until after the Second World War. What really is there to say at this point? You can tell Churchill is really trying to hem everything through a certain paradigm, explicitly so that he can create this world where the world wars are presumably avoided, and it is really entertaining. It certainly is, and it's well written as a piece of fiction, but coherent it is not. It causes all of these historical characters to do things completely out of character, out of turn for them. General Lee, who did have complex thoughts about slavery, which we can read in his reflections on the Mexican-American War, is now written to abolish it. Lee's wife did free her own slaves, and Lee and his wife supported the American Colonization Society before the war, but they actively did not support the abolitionist movement. And while Lee later insisted that his decision to support the Confederacy was not founded on the defense of slavery, his officers kidnapped free blacks and sold them into slavery to fund the war effort. And after the war, he clearly was not in favor of equal rights for the newly emancipated African Americans. Again, his relationship with slavery was indeed complex, which is probably why Churchill drew on Lee as an interesting character, but he romanticizes Lee quite a bit. And it simply doesn't make sense economically, politically, or personally for Robert E. Lee to magically usurp the power of Jefferson Davis and then make the explicit decision to abolish slavery. A move that would, again, have been politically untenable in the Confederacy, destroy their financial backing, destroy their war effort, even if it means that perhaps the British could have joined on their side. He makes several other narrative decisions like this pretty much whenever there is a pivotal moment in the timeline, and while it is, again, I think I've said this like 3 times already, it's entertaining and it's really, really fun to read, especially as a history buff, getting to see all of these names and things, come together. Again, it reads more like a fan fiction than anything. His decision to have the narrator be a historian from the alternate universe is also quite interesting. This counterfactual approach actually is an interesting rhetorical strategy because it creates a double layer of irony, presuming that the readers are aware of the actual historical outcome of all the events. But it is also disorienting at some times. Also, something interesting to mention, it seems that perhaps Churchill has projected his flavor of politics a bit onto these British statesmen as well, Gladstone and Disraeli, because by flipping their political parties to align with the political winds, he has these characters essentially do what he did, change their party to suit the supposed fluidity of ideology. Perhaps he did this to try to emphasize the interconnectedness of Anglo-American society, because of course this political shift in Britain is precipitated by something going on in America, and this much would make sense given his constant, at times almost fantastical assumption that the Americans would inevitably align with the British throughout the First and Second World Wars because of the civilizational and political connection between the two countries. But I've also thought that perhaps this choice with these British politicians also serves to justify his younger political years and the institutional wilderness that he found himself in as a result of them, when he switched sides from the Conservatives to the Liberals back to the Conservatives throughout his whole political career. He also completely overlooks the fact now that the Confederates control a ton of Mexico, which would bring with it its own sort of set of problems because Mexico is in a constant state of internal revolution, but they're sort of just never discussed ever again in the essay, so sorry Mexico. I mean, the whole time he is also basically sidestepping the inevitable racial and social complexities that the Confederate victory brings. He writes in a smooth transition to emancipation, with the Confederacy adopting, quote, institutions suited to the blacks' own cultural development. His words, not mine. So I guess the narrator and Churchill believe there's no need to discuss racism or integration, and he can just kind of stick to the geopolitics. I mean, it's kind of just ignoring the elephant in the room. Now, I did find something interesting. In 1929, Churchill took a tour of the Virginia battlefields with historian Douglas Southall Freeman, and later, after he wrote this essay, he went to Gettysburg battlefield with Dwight Eisenhower in 1959 after Eisenhower's presidency. Now, that historian, Freeman, was a Pulitzer Prize-winning author who wrote books about Robert E. Lee and George Washington and the Civil and Revolutionary Wars in America. His Lee biography is considered the definitive biography of the Confederate general, and throughout his writings, nuanced though they are and quite historically accurate, he does portray Lee in a more positive than negative light. Whether you want to say this is because Freeman was a Southerner and descendant of a Confederate family, or because history has just been too harsh on Lee, is up to you. But what is clear is that Freeman's perspective did clearly shape Churchill in his writing of this essay. And that's probably coming from the time they spent together, and Churchill, perhaps with not a great understanding of the full context of the Civil War, taking these comments about Lee to sort of logical conclusions and making certain assumptions about the character Both Freeman and Churchill independently criticized Lee's overconfidence at Gettysburg, and while Freeman's book R.E. Lee, published later in 1934, does not depict Lee as an abolitionist, it does talk about his moral character and post-war reconciliation efforts, and sort of recasts him as this unifying figure after the Civil War. So you can tell that perhaps there were some reasons why Churchill had these beliefs and these inklings about Lee that led him to write the character as he did. Civil War historian Shelby Foote, who was typically skeptical of alternate history, actually surprisingly praised the essay as an exception, describing it as, quote, a fantasy which transcends all my objections to exploring the what-ifs and might-have-beens in that great war. In the book Winston Churchill's Imagination, written in 2006, author Paul K. Alkin also says that the essay has a science-fictional quality, and also connects the very writing of the essay to Churchill's interest in H.G. Wells' book The Time Machine, suggesting that the semi-utopian, at least during the daytime, vision of a transformed future in The Time Machine influenced Churchill's approach to alternate history. By the way, The Time Machine is one of my all-time favorite fictional books, up there with The Phantom Tollbooth and The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. Simply a really good book. Regardless, Churchill's life, his military service, his personal and political reinvention throughout his younger years, and his thorough understanding of how to manipulate and paint with the English language are all qualities that made him so beloved in British and world history to this day. And these qualities all certainly shine through in his essay about Lee. From his early days as a cavalry officer, the experience of which he no doubt used to inform this alternate Gettysburg battle, all the way to his transformative leadership as Prime Minister during the Second World War, Churchill navigated a life and a world of crises while still managing to maintain a vivid and at times almost heartwarmingly optimistic imagination. While it's not really a perfect alternate history at all, this odd, somewhat egregious, yet strangely confident piece is a perfect little window into Winston Churchill in his entirety. Flaws, strengths, tendencies, inspirations, interests, and ultimately his writing was a skill that not only earned him the Nobel Prize in Literature, but also defined his memory as a leader who shaped the 20th century by imagining and directly confronting, seizing its myriad of possibilities. And that's where I'll be ending this video for today. As always, let me know what you think, and if you enjoyed the video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.